Good evening, everybody. My name is Ron Craighead. I'm a pilot and aerospace education officer for Squadron 57 of the Civil Air Patrol out of El Cajon, California. We fly a couple of airplanes out of Gillespie Field, and in addition to emergency services missions, we also do quite a bit of flight training of cadets and recurrent training for senior members. So because our cadets are learning in G1000 equipped Cessna 172 NAV3s with GFC 700 autopilots, go around buttons, things of that nature. The Pilot Operating Handbook it's a handful. So I decided to do a series that breaks down individual topics into kind of digestible chunks, if you will. You eat the elephant one bite at a time. So today I'm going to do something interesting as a first in the series. We're going to talk about pilot handbooks in general. We're going to talk about operating limitations, and we're going to talk about a bit of a controversy that came up just recently about we're talking about Cessnas. So yeah, I'm talking about slipping with flaps. This has been such a controversy that if you're a veteran of any Reddit discussion groups on the internet amongst pilots, they can kind of turn into a bit of a food fight. And somebody actually had a t-shirt made that said, "I slip Cessnas with flaps." It's that much of a controversy, right? People really get entrenched. Now, I'm not going to make a call one way or the other, but what I do want to do is take a look at official sources from the Airplane Flying Handbook, which describes slips, and the Pilot Operating Handbooks that we use. Pretty much we're going to focus on Cessnas because it's very common and it's what we train our pilots in. So let's get started. Pilot operating handbooks have evolved throughout the years. The first one I ever set my hands on, I found at an air museum in Morgan Hill, California, and I bought this. It's an F-51D, meaning that it was produced somewhere in the late 40s, right around the time the Army Air Corps became the Air Force, for pilots that are learning how to and currently flying that airplane. Always wanted to fly one. I still flip through the operating handbook here and there to take a look at what it can do and learn about the systems. It's organized a little differently than the operating handbooks that we see in front of us from 1977. Let's see, we've got the, bear with me, G1000 Pilot Operating Handbook, which is very similar in its layout and even a lot of its language. As many people know, the Cessna has been in production since, I believe, the mid-50s. There have been about 35,000 of them produced. The difference between these two manuals and aircraft, while significant because there's so many additional systems on the newer aircraft, they're organized the same. Chapter 2 is limitations in both of them. All the chapters are the same. You go to chapter 5 and the topic is the same in both of them. And as you're going to see as we present this topic, a lot of the language is identical. The Cessna 172 hasn't changed a whole lot, the airframe and aerodynamics, between 1977 and the brand new aircraft that we're training our cadets in right now. I think our current training aircraft has about 250 hours on it. So if you ever want to know what a 172 can do and whether it can do book numbers or not, the answer is yes. You should fly one of ours. It's really quite something. So at any rate, we're going to talk about the limitation or the limitations associated with slipping with flaps. And I kind of cringe as I say that because, you'll see when we get into it. There is a section in operating limitations of this particular handbook about slipping with flaps, but it's nuanced. At any rate, we're going to start out by talking about what a slip is. Now, this is the new Airplane Flying Handbook. It's been out less than a year. If you're an old school pilot that hasn't looked at the Airplane Handbook, Flying Handbook in a while, I encourage you to do so. It's kind of changed significantly. There's a chapter on conservation of energy that's really interesting. Aerodynamics were pretty rudimentary in the last one. And, then the next leap there is the probably aerodynamics for naval aviators. This is somewhere in the middle, but it describes a really important concept. So go ahead and take a look at that. It also fixes some things when it comes to ground reference maneuvers that never really made sense to me in the old version. So check this out. It's obviously a free download from the FAA, or if you're a hard copy person that likes to kill a fraction of a tree or recycled paper, feel free to order one on Amazon. They're about $20. So well worth it to sit down and flip through. And, a few of the things gave me a new perspective. So this is the section on intentional slips. It's interesting because it says a slip occurs when the bank angle of an airplane is too steep for the existing rate of turn. Here, it says that a slip is a combination of forward movement and sideward with respect to the longitudinal axis of the airplane movement, the lateral axis being inclined and the sideward moment being towards the low end of the axis. Kind of confusing, right? So, of course, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and it's actually better than the several we just read, right? I'm going to go ahead and zoom out a little bit. It's a new setup, guys, so bear with me. In essence, the airplane is traveling straight here. Here's the direction of movement, and this is a side slip. Direction of movement is straight in relationship to the center line of the runway, where relative wind is sideways. So technically, the airplane is really flying this way, aerodynamically speaking, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. It's flying this way in the body of air, which is moving in this direction, right? So it's flying in the body of air this way, but the net result is that it's traveling along the center line of the runway. And then there's the forward slip. Now, this is where things get interesting, all right? If you look at it, this direction is, drawing is actually kind of backwards. The wind is straight down the center line of the runway, and the direction of movement is down the center line of the runway. But the airplane is skewed. If you'll, now the greatest training aid ever, in essence, it's doing this number, flying down the runway like this. All right? Or in that case, I think it's probably a little more like this. It's flying a little sideways, presenting some of its, that's nuanced, but there's a difference, presenting some of the side of the fuselage to the oncoming wind. Why do you do that? Because that is really not aerodynamically efficient, okay? If you're flying this way, that whole side of the fuselage, the vertical tail, etc., is pushing against the relative wind, all right? That's going to slow you down. That's going to cause drag, right? And when that happens, you're going to expend energy. Remember, I talked about the conservation of energy principle that I want you to read about. You're expending energy that you wouldn't otherwise if this airplane in the drawing was flying with its longitudinal axis aligned with the center line of the runway. So you do that because you want to bleed off that energy. When do you want to bleed off that energy? Let's say you were approaching this runway and you were pretty high, maybe a little fast, and you still want to get down to the runway. Well, there are a couple of ways you can bleed off that energy, because remember, altitude is energy, right? And the momentum of airspeed is energy. If you've ever ridden a bicycle and tried to stop it, or driven a car and tried to stop it, you got to bleed off that energy and use brakes, right? So energy has to go somewhere. Brakes take that kinetic energy and convert it into heat. Welcome back. Had a little intermission because of a cat on the desk. Occupational hazard. Now, the chapter under this particular diagram has an interesting statement. Some pilots try to avoid using forward slips. An approach with flaps allows for coordinated and more familiar flight orientation. Flaps are another way of bleeding off energy. That's a topic for another subject. I guess we'll probably talk about that a bit too. At any rate, flaps allow you to conduct that landing while keeping your longitudinal axis aligned with the center line. And it also bleeds off energy in essence, right? So it adds drag and creates lift, which adds drag. It's induced drag. So it's saying that it's a little more comfortable for passengers and even the pilots, if you're a new pilot not used to forward slipping, because when you're landing with flaps, you put in flaps, and instead of a gradual descent, it gets a little steeper without picking up airspeed. Add a little more flaps, it gets steeper. So it seems like they accomplish the same thing, and to no small degree they do. And people are more comfortable with it because instead of doing something like this and coming at the runway kind of cockeyed, it's, straight on. There we go. Straight on, a little more comfortable. You get a nice view of the runway, and it's easy to do. So a lot of pilots don't like to use slips. So, to the controversy. I have known many great pilots, including the first one that taught me, that have taught using forward slips with flaps in Cherokees and Cessnas and many other things. However, somewhere along the line, Cessna put something in the pilot's handbook that discouraged the use of flaps when you're forward slipping a Cessna, a 172 specifically. I'm not a pilot of too many of the others. I don't know if it's in the 180. I have flown 182s, but I don't know if it's in their operating handbook. But we're talking about the 172 from two different model years. One is 2020 and one is from 1977. So what we're going to do is, if you've got a question on something like that and you hear some flight instructor tell you that you shouldn't ever slip a Cessna 172 with flaps, and another one says I do it all the time, it's fine, some lawyer wrote that, I've heard that, or they just don't want anybody to get frightened if they have some kind of reaction to it, so they put it in the POH or put a placard up. I've heard both sides of the argument from pilots that are excellent pilots, excellent instructors, and I really respect them. So I thought, what does the Pilot Operating Handbook say about it? So what I did is I downloaded a PDF of the POH. I did a Control F, and I put get out of my way. There we go. And I just put slip. Oh. Whoa. Right off the bat. That's harsh. All right, the first one it finds is something in Section 2, limitations. Now, let's touch on what a limitation is. If it's published in the POH that something is prohibited or it's a numerical limitation, right, such as VNE, velocity never exceed, that is a limitation that you are absolutely beholden to, okay? If it's said in this section or another section that doing something is prohibited, guys, that's sacrosanct. All right? We can't do that. Now, in limitations, there's this particular section called placards. And in almost every airplane you get into, there are going to be these little placards, and they're usually made of plastic, and there's letters etched in them, or it can even be one of those P-Touch label maker things, as long as it's on there. But those are specified, typically, those are specified in the Pilot Operating Handbook, and if they're specified that they're there, then, well, they're required to be in the cockpit, okay? Or the airplane isn't airworthy. Now, one of those says that there has to be a placard that says avoid slips with flaps extended. That's in the limitation section. So some people interpret that as meaning it's in the limitation section that there's a placard saying to avoid it, and thus it's a requirement. In this case, the limitation is you can't fly the airplane unless that placard exists. It's a warning placard, but doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do something. It says avoid. All right? Not just you can only do it in emergencies. Okay? If it says that something is prohibited, you can still do it in an emergency if you're pilot in command and you decide that, well, I got to do that, or, you know, the safety of my flight isn't insured. You declare an emergency and you can do things that are prohibited. It says avoid. And I'm going to reserve judgment at this point as to why they did that. But let's go ahead and you can debate this if you like. I'd like to hear your feedback on this, but avoid doesn't mean prohibited, and the limitation is that that placard has to be in the cockpit. All right, what's next? Where's the next one? Okay, this is an interesting one. This is in Section 3, Emergency Procedures. They're talking about a wing fire. Now, if you've got a wing fire, your wing is probably on fire because some of the wiring in your wing, shorted out. The only thing that I can think of that has a whole lot of electronics in it are the wingtip lights, the pitot tube. It's got a heating element, and that's about it. I believe the flap motors are inside the cockpit, so the flap motor, so that wouldn't count. Odds are good that if you have a fire, it's because you have a short in your lighting system, and that fire is going to be in your wingtip. In this case, it says if you have a wing fire, turn your navigation light switch off, your pitot heat switch off if installed, your strobe light switch off, and then perform a side slip to keep the flames away from the fuel tank and cabin. All right? So, if the pitot tube is on the left, well, we'll use a wingtip light. It's a little more clear. Wingtip light is on the left. I think it shows up on the right on your screen. But is on this side of the airplane. You want to slip so that that wing is further back and the wind blows the fire towards the tip and away from the root of the wing where your fuel tanks are, right? So you want to side slip down with a fire trailing off the wingtip. It also has the added benefit of giving you more drag, bleeding off all that altitude energy, right? So that once you do get down, you can go ahead and execute a landing. If you just dive straight, you're going to pick up airspeed. When you get down to, say, traffic pattern altitude over your emergency landing site, you're not going to be able to land because you're going to be doing 160 knots. You're probably going to be doing VNE. So anyway, this calls for a side slip in an emergency. Now, side slips aren't safe normally. Would you do them in an emergency? Possibly. We'll go ahead and think about that and put it in our quiver. What's next here? Let's see. Here's another emergency procedure. This one's due to icing. If you've got icing on your windshield, it says perform a landing approach using a forward slip if necessary for improved visibility. Okay, they're talking about icing where you might have icing on your windshield up front because the water impacts it and freezes up. Maybe if you side slip a little bit, you can look out the side window. Sounds a little crazy, but you actually do get a pretty decent view if you're using full rudder deflection to the basically full left rudder. You're going to get a pretty good view out your side window of the runway if ice is obstructing it. What's next? There we are again. All right. Here's where the controversy comes, the other part. So it says normal landing approaches can be made with power on or power off with any flap setting desired. Surface winds and air turbulence are usually the primary factors in determining the most comfortable approach speeds. Steep slips should be avoided with flap settings greater than 20 degrees due to slight tendency for the elevator to oscillate under certain combinations of airspeed, side slip angle, and center of gravity loadings. All right, well, that's interesting. Should be avoided because of oscillating. Now, there are different kinds of oscillations, right? When you change airspeed, for example, the airplane might oscillate a little bit until it finds an equilibrium in its angle of attack. And then eventually, because we have really stable airplanes, Cessna 172 is really stable, it'll eventually stop oscillating, climbing and descending, seeking out that angle of attack, and it'll fly smoothly. So that kind of oscillation isn't a big deal. If something's oscillating wildly, that's probably not a great thing, right? So, like anything else in life, or engineering, or flying, there are degrees. So, I'm not sure what they mean. Let's see what else they've got for us. Here's where things get nuanced. It says kind of the same thing at first. Crosswind landing. When landing in a strong crosswind, use the minimum flap settings required for the field length. If flap settings are greater than 20 degrees are used, in the side slips with full rudder deflection, some elevator oscillation may be felt at normal approach speeds. However, this does not affect control of the airplane. Then they go on to talk about the crab combination, which is another way of executing a crosswind landing, et cetera, et cetera. So here it's telling us that the side slip and the oscillations that can result don't really affect control of the airplane. If it oscillates but doesn't affect your ability to control the airplane, is it a safety problem? I would think that if someone is proficient in forward slips and practiced them on a fairly regular basis, and was confident in their ability to maintain control of the airplane, maintain appropriate airspeeds, and keep the airplane going where they want it to go, that this wouldn't be a problem, right? We experience oscillations and deviations all the time in flight, right? If you've ever flown through turbulence, you get the occasional random oscillation, all right? Gosh, if you can't handle a little deviation, correct for it, then you might need a little more training. So this is a really interesting section. It almost contradicts the other sections, or it adds to them and clarifies it, I guess you could say. Engine oil system. We're going to completely delve into slips here and how they relate to the 172. To drain the oil with this valve, slip a hose. Nope, that's an oil change. Let's see here. Okay, fuel quantities measured by two float type, yada yada. When an indicator shows empty in the tank, approximately 1.5 gallons remain in a standard tank and 2 gallons remain in a long-range tank as unusable fuel. So, side note, when your tanks are reading empty, little joke, they always say that the only time a fuel gauge is accurate is when the tank is empty, but mostly because they're not really precision instruments. But they say they're empty, there is fuel in it, but that fuel is unusable. The pickup isn't capable of taking that last little bit. Think about when you're drinking a milkshake or something and you're trying to get the last little bit out of the bottom. You're never going to get it all out of there, right? So you kind of tilt it and stuff the straw in the corner. You can get a lot more, but you can't do that in an airplane. So 1.5 to 2 gallons of unusable fuel is going to be on board. But let's see. Here's where the slip comes in. The indicators cannot be relied upon for accurate readings during skids, slips, or unusual attitudes. Let's think about that. The fuel tank, the bottom part of it, is right here along the root, okay? Right here, along the fuselage. You've got dihedral, a little less dihedral than this. That's wings are curved upwards, right? Got dihedral that forces all the fuel towards the fuselage. Now, is that the case if you're in a slip and the wing is low? No. You're going to be at a point where the pickup is technically going to be at the lowest point, right? But when the airplane's banked in a slip, it's no longer the lowest point. The fuel selector valve should be in both positions for takeoff, climb, landing, and maneuvers that involve prolonged slips or skids. Operation from left or right tank is reserved for cruising flight. For just that reason, right? Love these airplanes. Always have. What's next here? Well, I guess that's it. That's all it has to say about slips or skids. Let's go to the new version. Now, it's interesting to note that in the new version of the Cessna 172s, the ones that are rolling off the assembly line every day right now, there is no placard that says you should avoid slips in a Cessna 172, the new ones. All right, the airplane's gone. So we're going to do this again. We're going to go Control F. We're going to put in slip. Typing correctly. Oh, come on. There we are. Okay, this is interesting and new. This reference in the 172S nav 3 G1000 version. I think it's probably the same in the round dial version, although I don't think they make those anymore. Maximum slip or skid duration with one tank dry is 30 seconds, right? We already discussed how you can, you know, lose fuel suction because the pickup, if all the fuel's towards the tip, can be sucking air. You get air in the fuel tubes and the engine doesn't run. So maximum slip or skid duration with one tank dry, 30 seconds. Interestingly enough, that means that it'll be drinking off of the sump, right? The little tank in the very front of the airplane for a while. So they figure it's safe to do it for 30 seconds. What's next? Oh yeah, we're back here to the icing section. Same language. Next is about slip skid information and how that's displayed in the G1000. And that's it. I know there's more in here. Okay, here we go. Landing, normal landing, it slips. All right. Normal landing approaches can be made with power on or power off with any flap setting. Sounds really familiar, doesn't it? Within the flap airspeed limits, surface winds and air turbulence, yada yada. Steep slips with flap settings greater than 20 degrees can cause slight tendency for the elevator to oscillate under certain combinations of airspeed, slide slope angle, and center of gravity loadings. Very familiar. Fuel indicating systems. Okay, but note, in this case, note what's not there, right? There's nothing in the limitations on this airplane. Now, a couple things to note. I'm not going to make any kind of call what you should or should not do. Obviously, you should read the Pilot Operating Handbook and understand the limitations of the airplanes. There are also things in this book that are going to tell you things that are not limitations that you should absolutely understand, right? You shouldn't just know the things that are prohibited. You need to know, well, everything concerning the safety of the flight. So, secondly, how do I put this? Let's go back to the Airplane Flying Handbook and our really cool drawings here. So this particular side slip and this forward slip, again, we already determined that they are aerodynamically identical, right? Orientation of the wind and orientation of the ground are the only things that are really different. But when it comes to the airplane passing through the air and the angles at which that happens, they're the same. This is a crosswind landing technique, and I've never had any of the, well, we'll call them never slippers, tell me that I shouldn't compensate for a crosswind. So even they, I'm quite sure, side slip when they're compensating for a crosswind, so they are slipping a Cessna because I'm pretty sure they're going to have flaps in. So they're doing it whether they know it or not. Again, I'm not going to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. You should read your POH. You should talk to your flight instructor. You should talk to a couple of flight instructors. I learn something new every time I do. And you should do your research. I'm a commercially rated pilot. I'm a flight instructor applicant. And I learned quite a bit going through this little exercise. You even stumble across things that in the manual that you might have read early on in your flying career, that you read, took at face value, but really didn't understand. But you understand it a little better now. 13 years after I first started flying, that's still happening. So, at any rate, I guess I will tell you that I do commonly slip 172s, 172Ns, and 172Ss with flaps when I end up a little high. And I've already got full flaps in. I've already got the throttle at idle. Now, a lot of you are probably saying, why don't you go around? Fair point, and that is probably the best argument against doing that. All right, if you're really that off the glide slope, maybe you should just go around. No shame in it. True, but it is a good tool in your toolbox for emergency procedures. Here's a good example. For those of you who are commercially rated pilots, you understand the power off 180. That's where you are beam the numbers and you kill power to the engine by pulling the throttle closed. It's obviously still idling, but you've essentially got no thrust, no appreciable thrust. And then you have to make a 180-degree turn to the runway and land on a spot or 200 feet, no more than 200 feet beyond it. Now, when you're doing that, you have to judge your height pretty precisely. And you can adjust that a couple of different ways. You can change how sharp your pattern is, how squared off it is, etc. You can use flaps. But the one thing you can't do in this whole conservation of energy model is get more energy, right? Once the engine dies, you've got two types of energy on the airplane, right? The momentum, forward momentum, and you need to keep some of that, right? You can't cash that all in for altitude because then you stall the airplane, right? So you got to keep your momentum up, meaning your airspeed has to be at best glide. And you've got to keep enough altitude to keep that momentum up so that you can touch down within 200 feet. 200 feet. If you decide you're going to put in a ton of flaps, and you're going to go long, you've got too much energy. Oftentimes, the last thing in your toolbox is a forward slip. And if you've got flaps in, and you are competent and trained and proficient in forward slipping, a Cessna with flaps, you can come down pretty fast. Now, obviously, you've got to kick it back out because you're not aligned longitudinally with the center line of the runway, but you got to kick it out at the last minute, but it can help you bleed off that energy. Now, that's great in a check ride. Where it can really help you and save your life is in a situation where you've lost an engine, you're trying to hit an emergency landing site, and here's a little tidbit of information, sports fans. The majority of forced landings actually land long. That's a problem because in most cases, you're going to be landing in some kind of confined area. Maybe you got lucky. You're landing on a long straight road out in the country. Maybe you're landing in a huge, huge field that's wide open. But in most cases, you're not going to have 1,000 flat feet to land on. You might have, I don't know, 500, 700 feet, maybe less. But you're going to want to touch down right at your intended point so that you've got the longest roll and the least damage when you run out of flat territory, right? So that is a precision power off landing, and You want to use all of the tools in your toolbox. Now, do I recommend attempting that? Attempting a forward slip with flaps in an emergency if you don't do them regularly? Absolutely not, right? Hey, you're the pilot in command. If it's an emergency and you think that's going to save your life, by all means. But I also recommend that you do it occasionally under starting with a flight instructor. I kind of told you I wasn't going to recommend that. So, no, talk to your flight instructor. If you decide you're going to do it with a flight instructor that really can teach you to do it safely, get you confident. If you decide that you're not cool with it, as it says in this manual, a lot of folks aren't. Great, no problem. Maybe you're a never slipper with flaps. So, at any rate, that's what I've got for you today. It's just my perspective. Again, talk to your flight instructor. I do some ground instruction, but I'm not your instructor. So go ahead and take this all with a large grain of salt. Do your own research and have a fantastic day.